Hi everybody, my name's Julia from Bobbins and Buttons, and today I've got 5 useful overlocker tips to share with you. So let's head over to the overlocker. So just before I start, I want to mention that I'm going to show you these tips and techniques on woven calico, but they all do translate equally as well to jersey fabric. And as we go through, I'll explain where these tips and techniques might be useful. So first off, I want to show you how to finish a seam with the overlocker while you're overlocking. And this is particularly good if you're making things like baby clothing or small children's clothing, and you've got something like a sleeve opening that you've had to hem before you join the underarm seam. And another time I've used it is if you're making things like a tulle skirt and you're not actually even going to hem it, it's just a cut edge. So to start with, lift your foot and just make sure the chain of stitching is free and not caught up in any way, and put your fabric in place just like you normally would. Now just start to sew, and you basically want to just get a couple of stitches into the fabric and make sure your needles are down at this point, and now lift the foot again and bring the chain the other side in front of your stitch line. So essentially we're going to stitch this into the seam, which will secure it. So give it a slight pull to make sure there's no loops, and then you can drop the foot again and carry on stitching. So aim to have your chain inside the stitches if you can. And once you've done a few stitches, you can let the knife cut this end off. And there we go. So essentially you've stitched that in, and you've got a nice neat finish on the edge. So next I want to show you corners. So I've got an angled corner like this, and I've got an internal corner like this. So both of these you might find on garments quite regularly. Something like this you might find on a pocket bag, and this is quite common on jersey dresses and tops, where you've perhaps inserted your sleeve as a flat piece and now you've got to stitch your underarm and side seam in one continuous piece. So I'll show you the angled one first. So this is really quite simple. So I'm going to start by just sewing this seam. And actually this is another little tip. If you carry on sewing and you happen to not have your scissors handy, you can carry on sewing your overlock chain and just swing your chain into the line of stitching, and the knife will cut it for you. So there we go. So now literally all I'm going to do is stitch the other side. And I think that's really the best way to do a neat corner for something like a pocket bag. So now I'll show you the other corner. So this again is pretty simple. So we're going to start by sewing, and when you get to the actual corner, just stop. So the knife is now at the actual corner, and then what I'm going to do, rather than trying to go round that, I'm just going to pull the fabric into a straight line. I'm going to try and make sure that the fabric is still butted up to the knife so I can have a nice clean finish. So you might need to do a couple of stitches really slowly here. And now you've got a bit of fluff, but a really nice neat corner. So this next technique is really good for bulky fabrics when you've got lots of overlock seams where you need to line them up and they become a little bit bulky. And I think this is really particularly a good technique for cuffs and hem bands and neck bands as well. So I'm going to pretend this is a cuff band to show you this technique. So I'm just going to start by stitching the side together. And then if this were a cuff band, we'd be bringing the raw edges together and folding that so it becomes the cuff. But then obviously what you've got here is two very bulky seams. I'm just going to trim those ends off. You can see. So trying to sew those two and then the seam from the sleeve as well can be really bulky, and some overlockers can struggle with that. So what you can do is just flip one seam one way and one the other. But that often, especially in the instance of a cuff, you can feel the twist in there. So if you go back inside, and this does feel slightly wrong to do, but if you just make a small cut, making sure you're not cutting the first line of stitching, because the first line of stitching is going to hold it together. And then you can let one seam lie one way and the other seam lie the other way, and that will just make it a lot easier to stitch your cuff onto the sleeve end and less bulky at that point. So this next technique is for when you've got that line of overlock chain at the end of a seam. So it might be something like, this is usually on something like the round, so if you've done like an armhole edge, or a neck facing, or neck band, cuff band, hem band, that type of thing, and you've just got an overlocking chain that's not going to go into another seam. So I must admit, if I'm doing something like that, I'll quite often stitch over the start just so that I've got double stitching and I can just cut that off. But if you do feel like you want a little bit more security, what you can do is just pull the chain so that you can thread it through the eye of a wide-eyed needle. So I've just pulled that and I'm going to cut that off around here. And then if you get a wide-eyed needle, it needs to be pretty wide. I'll need to trim that again. So you can get all of the threads, all 4 threads, in through the needle eye. And then just take the needle and pass it at the back of the stitches along for about, a few centimetres, and then pull that through. And then you can just snip that end off and that's neatly secured. So the last technique I'm going to show you is unpicking, and nobody likes unpicking. But if you've got to unpick overlocking, it can feel like a complete disaster. So the easiest way I know to do this, but you are potentially going to lose a little bit of seam, is just to trim the very, very edge off your seam. So I'm literally taking off that much. So all you're doing is cutting the edge, go all the way along, so you're cutting off like 1 millimetre really. And then if you just take a pin or a small pair of scissors and pick at the stitching at the start, we'll get rid of your excess bit there. Once you get the 2 needle threads, and just pull. You do get left with lots of tassely little threads, but you've unpicked it. So I hope you found those tips useful. If you've got any questions, feel free to leave comments below. I post videos here on my channel weekly, so if you'd like to see more videos, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thanks for watching.